start my recording here on session number 23 of Old Testament Survey. We're in the book of Judges today. The book of Judges continues the primary history of the Old Testament. It moves the history along another 300 years after the conquest. We could put this all in a timeline, but I think it's fairly clear. Abraham goes back around 2000 BC, and Joseph finally arranges for Jacob and the people to go down into Egypt. That accounts for another 430 years, from around 1876 to around 1446 BC. And around 1400 BC, Joshua came across the Jordan into the promised land, and he was outlived by his elders by some 30 years or so. And after the death of Joshua and his elders, we enter a period of Israel's history that we call the period of the Judges. Now, judges are not men who sit in black robes in courtrooms and hand out fines for traffic tickets. Judges were usually somewhat military. They're military political kind of leaders. They were not kings. They were not prophets. They were not lawgivers. But they had the role of reorganizing society after some kind of a catastrophe or breakdown. Bad things happened when people walked away from God. And the judges tried to put the country back together again. This went on for 300 years until it was finally time for Samuel to begin anointing kings of Israel. So this is a 300-year period that is in general called the Judges period. It's interesting because it's characterized by two lines. Early in the book, we see the line, and now there rose up a generation which did not know the Lord, neither the things which the Lord had done for Israel. Okay, so that's characteristic number one, is that people stopped teaching their children about the Word of God and about the history of God's work with His people. So this is a characteristically bad thing for any nation and any place in the world. When people turn away from God, one of the very first things that happens is that their children forget. The children may never have known, but the children forget. And as a result of that, the whole culture, the whole society begins going off in godless directions. This is normal. We've seen the same thing happen all over the world for thousands of years. The history is clear. And Israel's history is not terribly different from all of the rest of us. The principle is uniform. When the parents stop teaching their children the truth, nobody else is going to bother. And the culture will slowly deteriorate. We see this happening in the Western world, the so-called Western world, which means Europe and the European influence throughout the world, the United States, the Western Hemisphere in general, the nations who have generally followed the Western and European traditions. The Judeo-Christian heritage is gradually falling off, is gradually disappearing in most of the world. And those of us who are pastors, missionaries, Bible teachers, are fighting a delaying action. We're trying to slow the decay down. That's what was happening in Israel. The judges came to try to slow the decay. And what we see over the period of the 300 years of the judges is that the initial judge, yeah, let's see if I can get this on screen. The initial judge was way up here. Othniel was a very good guy, and he was reasonably successful, and he did a good job. And then we get not so good. Ehud is a pretty good judge, but not quite so successful. Gideon is way down here in the middle someplace. And by the time we get to the end of the track, you've got Jephthah and Samson, both of whom are terrible examples. And then the end of the book gives us some um, additional details about how bad things are at this time. And they're genuinely terrible. They're really, really awful. Because what we see is a downward trajectory of Israel's culture. It begins to uh, decompose, to come apart at the seams. And it's because people have forgotten the Lord and the things that the Lord has done.
Are you supposed to be sharing the screen?
No, I've got that one up now, Donna.
Okay,
I haven't started sharing the screen. Donna is wondering if I'm sharing a screen or if I'm just talking. I'm going to start showing you a screen now so that you know where we are. This is Judges, and okay. And into the presenter view, bingo, okay, that worked. Okay, this shot is taken actually from an airplane. I didn't take it. I wish I had. That's actually Gibeon. For what it's worth, the modern El Jib and the ancient Tel Gibeon. The a period of the judges takes place mostly in the hill country of Israel. We see a lot of things happening up in the hill country. The chronology of the book pretty straightforward. The Exodus took place in 1446, and the wilderness wandering takes place over a period of 40 years till around 1406 BC. From Joshua to Othniel, probably 25 or 30 years. Then from Othniel until Jephthah, Jephthah has to be around 1105 BC for a variety of reasons. Another 275 years. So we see a total of 300 years from roughly 1400 BC to roughly 1100 BC. From Jephthah until King Saul, roughly 82 years. And a lot of things don't work right, but we're going to see how these things add up. Saul traditionally is given a date of 1050 or 51 BC. David traditionally has a date of 1010 BC, and that's probably pretty accurate. 1003 BC is the date for David's taking the overall control over all of Israel. Solomon's date, beginning of the reign, is 970 BC. And those dates are pretty good. The farther along we get with dates into the Old Testament, the more accurate the dates become. I believe 1446 is a very accurate date, and therefore 1406 also very accurate. Saul, we have some textual problems with, but David and Solomon's dates are generally agreed to be very, very accurate. Solomon's particularly is plus or minus not more than a year. David's, we have some questions about when he began his reign in Hebron, but his reign in Jerusalem has to be 1003 BC plus or minus just a year or two. The what is it, 3000th anniversary of Jerusalem as Israel's capital happened in Israel a few years back. And I managed to be there that year. It was interesting to see people celebrating something that goes back so far. Okay, a question to answer as we get into the chronology of the period. It has to do with the chronology of the individual judges. So I just mentioned this. The judges tend to overlap. Not every judge was active. Well, the judges were not active in the whole nation. They were active locally, where we might see Othniel dealing with the Mesopotamian kings. Ehud is going to deal with a Jordan Valley event around Jericho. Samson dealt with the Philistines. They overlapped. We can't always exactly measure the overlapping, but the mistake that we would make would be adding up the years of oppression and the years of peace as though they were in a sequence, because they're not in a sequence. We'd end up with 500 or 600 years. I've forgotten exactly how many, but we end up with a whole lot of years when in fact the judgeships overlap. And so one judge might be dealing with an oppression while another is in his time of peace. And they don't necessarily relate to one another. Sometimes they do, but for us, that isn't going to be important. Okay, conditions during the period of the judges can be characterized as actually the second most important idea in the book. The first was there rose up a generation who didn't know the Lord because their parents didn't teach them. The second very important verse that's repeated over and over in the book of Judges is, in those days there was no king in Israel, and so everyone did what seemed right in his own eyes. The lack of a king led to a kind of anarchy where everyone did what seemed right. Now, that doesn't mean that everyone did wrong. We're going to see the little book of Ruth when we get done with Judges, which happens during the time of the Judges period. Judges is a bit depressing because every judge does a little less good until we get finally to the end of the period when things are really bad, just really awful. The political situation during the time of the judges was, at least at the beginning, dominated by Egypt. The whole area of Canaan was under Egyptian domination. The spot that I took this picture, let's see what picture am I showing you? Oh yes, of course. This is Bet Shan in the Jezreel Valley in Israel. And the mud brick house that I've pictured here is the Egyptian governor's palace in Bet Shan that dates to the period of the judges, dates to about 1300 BC. Bet Shan is one of the cities that was taken by Joshua during the conquest, and then reoccupied by the Canaanites. The Canaanites came under the political control of Egypt during these years. And it will be sometime later, during the time of the kings, actually during the time of David, that Bet Shan would finally be taken by Israel. This is not something that is going to happen quickly. So Egyptian domination most of the period. There are local powers that we have to worry about. Among them, the Philistines and the Ammonites. The Philistines are to the west along the coast and what is today known as the Gaza Strip. Not a very nice bit of real estate for most people who live there, although it's quite nice for the Hamas warlords and their cronies. They've got palaces, but the ordinary people in Gaza are really in bad shape. It's a very poverty-stricken area. The eastern side of the Jordan River was dominated by the Ammonites. During the time of the judges, we're not going to run into the Arameans of Syria so much. Moabites and Edomites will get in on some of this, but the Ammonites are a continuing problem. And I guess we could say what we're going to see there is a kind of a pincer movement, where Ammonites are pushing in from one way and Philistines are pushing the other way, with Israel in between. And there's a great deal going on during that time. Those problems won't be ended until well into the time of David. David will be fighting Philistines and Ammonites. So all of these hundreds of years are going on. The other major powers of the time were mostly to the north. Hittites are in Turkey, and the Mitanni are in Mesopotamia. Both of those are major powers. They have a tendency to counterbalance Egypt. And during these centuries, we see the occasional conflict between either Hittites or Mitanni and Egypt along the international trade route. So those battles will take place usually farther to the north, but sometimes as far south as Israel. They don't show up in the Bible, however. So, what is this book really going to be about then? The purpose and the theme of the book of Judges is to describe the inevitable cycle of judgment which follows apostasy. Okay, when I say inevitable, I mean it's a law of nature. God built this into the system. When we commit apostasy, that is, when we walk away from God, whether we are Christian or not, the result in the broader society is collapse. And the collapse appears to take place as a result of natural causes. Foreign and domestic enemies rise up, riot in the streets, tear down our statues, cause all kinds of problems here, there, and another place. Those things happen because the nation as a whole has walked away from God. That's what apostasy means. It's a Greek word, apostasis, which means to stand away or to take a stand on the other side, to walk away from something. In particular, the book of Judges records Israel's disobedience to the Lord and the subsequent need for a human king. What the repeating line in Judges keeps coming back. In those days, there was no king in Israel, and everyone did what seemed right in his own eyes. The author of the book of Judges appears to believe that Israel needs a king. But I would argue that none of the human leaders in Judges proved to be adequate to the task. And later on, none of the kings of Israel, not Saul, not David, not Solomon, or any of the later kings, proved up to the task. And in fact, what the book of Judges is looking forward to is no human king, but rather Christ himself, the Messiah, coming with the eternal kingdom. There is ultimately the solution to the problem. There will be no more apostasy. There will be no more judgments. It will be done under Christ the King. But alas, we're not there yet. So where are we going now? Okay, the documentary, the cycles of apostasy that we're going to see. And let's see, what did I have here? Book of Judges. I'm not going to do much with the introductory stuff. I want you to see a cycle, though. The cycle of apostasy looks like this. And so the people did the evil thing. The The Hebrew is interesting. It uses the article. Instead of saying the people did evil, we're told the people did the evil thing. And commentators have wondered about that. When I wrote my commentary on Judges for the Moody commentary, I came to the conclusion that there's a specific sin in mind. Probably the sins associated with idolatry, the sensuality and the prostitution of the Canaanite worship. The people were dragged off into, by their own lusts, the sin associated with Canaanite idolatry. And so the people did the sin, and as a result of that, they suffered under foreign oppressors. I call this subjugation. You'll notice I'm using S's because those are easy to come up with a series with. Subjugation or oppression to a foreign ruler would last a number of years, sometimes just a few years, sometimes 20 or 30 years, but for a period of time, some foreign ruler, whether a king or a warlord, would oppress a portion of the people of Israel. And during that time, or at least by the end of that time, the people would begin to pray. And I call this supplication. So sin, subjugation, supplication. The people begin to pray. They finally realize we have really blown it this time. We've made a big mistake. It's time for us to pray. And when they would pray, eventually God would send salvation of some kind in the form of a judge. And the judge is a charismatic or spirit empowered leader who has the ability to reorganize the problem that the people have gotten themselves into. Let's begin to put it back together again. So this is the cycle, or what we sometimes call the judges cycle. And each of the judges' stories that we see from chapters 2 through 16 follows this same pattern. So the people did something evil, they were subjected to some foreign power. They began to make supplication. They prayed for deliverance. And finally, a judge was sent who delivered them from their oppressor, and the nation had peace for a certain amount of time. And then the people did sin in the eyes of the Lord, and they were subjugated and supplicated and saved again. And the cycle goes on. The cycle is a natural one. It is a natural cycle of apostasy and judgment. God continues to do what he can, and yet there is a steady decline in the overall quality of Israel's society that would never come back. Even during the time of the kings, the overall quality of Israel's society never came back. The revivals that were attempted under David and Solomon, later under Josiah, even Hezekiah, never brought the nation back to the place where it was. They were at their high point, which is kind of sad to think about, under Moses, and never came back to that. It couldn't happen because they forgot the Lord. They walked away from God. So the outline of the book is fairly easy. The introduction to Judges is in the first chapter and a few verses. The documentary of the cycles of apostasy goes through a long string of judges. There's only a few that we'll actually need to look at. And then we have an epilogue, what comes afterwards in chapters 17 through 21. It's a fairly easy book to outline. The causes that introduce the days of the judges are given to us here in chapter 1 of Judges, and it's a failure to it begins with a failure to maintain separation between the people of Israel and the larger Canaanite world. We see the death of Joshua actually spoken of twice in this book. We see it in 1:1, and we see it again in 6 or in 2:6. So when did Joshua die? Well, he only died the one time. And that's reported at the end of Joshua. It's reported here at the beginning of Judges. Chapter 1 tells us some of the things that were happening at the end of Joshua's life. The most important being that not all of the Canaanite areas were taken. There were places where the people of Israel would not go. They refused to go there because the Canaanites who lived there insisted on staying, which of course is how that works. If you're invading a place, the only reason that an invasion is necessary at all is that the people who are there don't want to leave. So the Canaanites didn't want to go, and they fought a good fight to stay. Even though Israel had conquered all of their armies. Now the armies are going to be slowly rebuilt. And we find during the days of the judges, the Canaanites are still there. And for the most part, the wars of Israel are not against the Canaanites who lived in their midst. The Israelites found the Canaanite society, Canaanite culture, and religion very attractive. And so there was a failure to maintain a national separation from the sinful surrounding world. That leads to degradation, degeneration of the nation of Israel. Some other commentators have said incomplete obedience leaves the seeds of disaster. So the people were commanded to drive out all of the Canaanites and to take the land where they would have blessing. Instead, they chose to be only partially obedient. Incomplete obedience, partial obedience. They thought they were being pretty good, and God doesn't reward pretty good. This takes us back to some salvation issues. Salvation is possible only for perfection. So if you're going to get to heaven by works, you better be really, really good. If you're going to be getting to heaven on the basis of God's grace, you're in luck, because that actually works very well. Okay, incomplete obedience, a religious and spiritual background, the first little part here. The angel of the Lord in 2:1 went up from Gilgal to Bochim, and he said, I brought you up from Egypt. I brought you into the land that I swore to give to your fathers. I said, I'll never break my covenant with you, and you shall make no covenant with the inhabitants of this land. You shall break down their altars, but you've not obeyed my voice. What is this that you've done? So now I say, I will not drive them out before you. They shall become thorns in your side. Their gods will be a snare to you. As soon as the angel of the Lord spoke these words, all the people of Israel lifted up their voices and wept. And so the name of the place is called Bochim, which means they cried. And they sacrificed there to the Lord. They made a big show of religious ritual. God is not interested in our religious ritual. He's interested in our willingness to walk with Him. And the blessing is determined by our willingness to walk with God. The ritual doesn't save us, neither does it keep us saved. At its best, religious ritual is a reminder of what our relationship to God ought to be. And so the Lord's Supper doesn't save us, it's a reminder of what Jesus did, and helps us to maintain our walk with Him. The people made their sacrifices as though that would do something to make up for generations of disobedience. It didn't work. So we go on. So after Joshua died, we see the cycles of apostasy beginning. There's a new generation of idolaters. As people served the Lord during Joshua's life. He was 110 years old when he died, and he was buried in the hill country of Ephraim. And all that generation were gathered to their fathers, and there arose, this is 2:10, there arose another generation after them who did not know the Lord or the work that he had done for Israel. Now you'll remember, I know, Deuteronomy 6. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And you shall love the Lord with all your heart, all your mind, all your strength. And these words that I'm speaking to you today shall be in your heart. You should keep on your foreheads and on your hand. And all these words that I'm speaking to you today, you shall teach to your children when you lie down and when you rise up and when you walk along the path. You teach these to your children in order that you may live long in the land that the Lord your God is giving you, that it may go well with you, that there might be a blessing there. So the point of our obedience to God in teaching our children is so that they might share in the blessing that God has given to us. That's the whole point. And a new generation of idolaters rose up because their parents didn't teach them the truth. No one else has the responsibility to teach our children. We do. And maybe the school system can help. Maybe the church can help. I'd like to think that the church can be helpful there. But the responsibility lies with parents. We have the responsibility to make sure that our children know the truth. The method for doing that is up for grabs. I'm willing to have that argument, but the responsibility is not negotiable. So a new generation of idolaters, not so good. And the people of Israel did the evil thing in the sight of the Lord. This is 2:11. And they abandoned the Lord, the God of their fathers, and brought them out of the land of Egypt. They went after other gods. They abandoned the Lord and served the Baals and Ashtaroth. Multiple Baals, by the way. Sometimes we speak of Baal as though he were a single powerful god, but actually there were multiple Baals. There was a separate Baal on the top of every mountain. If you look at this little this picture in the background, this is the hill country of Ephraim, just north of the Benjamin area. This is the path that leads down the Ajalon Valley. It's kind of a difficult road to drive. It goes up and over the top here and there and over here and there. But every hillside that you see, there's a hilltop, there's a hilltop, there's a hilltop, here's a two hilltops, there's another one over here, there. Every hilltop has an altar to Baal in the Old Testament period. There were thousands of them. We find the remains of holy places on hilltops all over Israel. Sometimes they're called high places. And a high place is literally a high place. It's not merely an important place, it's up above everywhere else because it's on top of the mountain. In the Psalms, there's a famous line. It goes, "I will lift up my eyes unto the Lord, unto the hills. I will lift up my eyes to the hills, to those mountains over there." From whence cometh my help? My help comes from the Lord. My help doesn't come from the hills, because on those hills are the altars of all of the Baals. When Balaam came to sacrifice, to make his sacrifices to supposedly Yahweh, he went to these hilltops, these high places where Baal was worshipped. He worshipped in all of the wrong places. The people of Israel did that thing. Okay. They served the Baals, plural, and the Ashtaroth. Ashtaroth is the plural of Asherah. That's a feminine name. The Asherah is not an altar, but rather a sacred pillar, usually a wooden pole. Here in America, we use big trees to make telephone poles. And you just put those in a hole in the ground and sit them straight up. And that's to be delicate about it. That's a fertility symbol. And the people used the Asherah poles as meeting places for prostitutes and their customers. That's where this happened. So in order to worship the Baals and the Ashtaroth meant to engage in the whole Canaanite fertility cult. This was a genuinely disgusting thing. This is the reason that the three cities of Canaan, Jericho, Ai, and Hatzor, were burned. This is where those things happened. So Israel was being bad. So the Lord raised up judges. This is in verse 16, 2:16. See if I'm figuring this out correctly. The Lord raised up judges who saved them out of the hands of those who plundered them, yet they did not listen to their judges. They whored after other gods and bowed down to them. They soon turned aside from the way of the Lord, in which their fathers had walked, who had obeyed the commandments of the Lord, and they did not do so. Okay. So we see bondage to a variety of different foreign oppressors. A deliverer is finally sent in response to the people's prayer. Finally, there is peace, but at the same time, apathy. Once the people had peace, it no longer seemed important to them. Chapter 3 at verse 7, we're going to look at a servitude to Mesopotamia with the first official judge. Othniel is the model for all of the later judges because he has all of the standard parts in place. We see the sin, we see the subjugation, the oppression, we see supplication, we see the salvation at the hands of Othniel. Now, Othniel is a interesting guy. He's a nephew, apparently, of Caleb, of Joshua and Caleb fame. And he is empowered by the Spirit of God. He gives the people 40 years of rest in verse 11. So he's a pretty good guy. We don't know very much about him, but what we know is basically good. Here's the story, and it's fairly straightforward. And the people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. They forgot the Lord their God and served the Baals and Ashtaroth. Therefore, here comes the second step in the cycle. The anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel. He sold them into the hand of Cushan-Rishathaim, king of Mesopotamia. Now, Cushan-Rishathaim is a king of whom we know nothing else. He is apparently not a very important king, but he was a big enough king to command a band of warriors who could make trouble most likely in the northern part of Israel. So Cushan-Rishathaim and the people of Israel served Cushan-Rishathaim 8 years. But when the people of Israel cried out to the Lord, there's that supplication, the Lord raised up a deliverer for the people of Israel, who saved them. There is salvation. Othniel, son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother, and either younger brother or nephew. Uh, the the Hebrew is ambiguous enough that it could go either way. And the Spirit of the Lord was upon him, and he judged Israel. That is, he reordered the territory in order to bring peace, bring again an orderliness, a law and order to that part of Israel. And he went out to war, and the Lord gave Cushan-Rishathaim, king of Mesopotamia, into his hand. His hand prevailed over Cushan-Rishathaim. So the land had rest for 40 years, and Othniel, son of Kenaz, died. So we have this is the standard story. One detail that's important to notice is that the land only had peace as long as Othniel lived. In the case of all of the judges, their time of peace lasts only throughout their lives. When that was done, it was all over. And so, of course, we see at the end of this sequence, we see Samson, who is put to death by the Philistines, and then the Philistine oppression simply continues down to the time of the kings. He simply didn't succeed at all. So anyway, there's the first one. And Othniel is a pretty good guy, and most of what he did was pretty helpful. And he delivered some northern region of Israel from the Mesopotamian warlord by the name of Cushan-Rishathaim. By the way, this character in the chariot is probably not Cushan-Rishathaim. And you'll notice that this particular chariot is drawn by 2 horses, and that in turn is being led by a couple of people. So this king of Mesopotamia is actually in a parade. He has a servant carrying an umbrella over the top of him. I don't know that Cushan-Rishathaim looked like this, but it might have been close to it. You'll notice he has an 8-spoked chariot wheel. So this is not a war chariot. This is a ceremonial chariot. Anyway, that's all neither here nor there, and we don't need to know that. But this gives you just an idea of how a foreign ruler like Cushan-Rishathaim might have looked. He might have come to town looking just like that. Then we come to the first really interesting judge. And this is Ehud. The story of Ehud is one of my absolute favorites. I really like Ehud and the story of Eglon, the very fat king of Moab. The king of Moab came and established his rule over a central of the Jordan, an area of the Jordan Valley around Jericho. And I've chosen this spot for a background picture. The kids that you see there in the central part of the picture were high school kids back in the day. This was in the early 90s, so those kids are all grown up and they've got families of their own, probably grandkids by this time. But they went to Israel with me, and this is a spot near Jericho called Hisham's Palace. Hisham was actually a medieval Muslim ruler in this region, and this is his palace, complete with a harem and all of the rest of it. Is really quite an extensive spot. It's on the north side of the city of Jericho, the modern village area of Jericho, about 2 kilometers from the ancient Tell. Some of us believe that it's better than even chance that Hisham's palace is built over the top of a water source that marks Gilgal, where Joshua camped. Now, we're not sure of that, but it's a possibility. There is a water source there, and that's what made it attractive to Hisham. And it may have made it attractive to Joshua. It may have made it attractive to Eglon. Whatever, this is a good place to pitch your tent or to set up your palace. So Eglon set up his headquarters, complete with a multi-story structure of some kind, because he has an upper room with an inner room, kind of a bathroom upstairs. Eglon had quite a palace here in the region of Jericho. So let's read the story because it's kind of fun. And the people of Israel again did that evil thing in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord strengthened Eglon, the king of Moab, against Israel, because they had done what was evil. And he gathered to himself Ammonites and Amalekites and other nomadic peoples, and went and defeated Israel, and they took possession of the city of palms. And you see some palm trees in the background there. This is characteristic of Jericho. City of palms is Jericho. Now, Jericho itself had been destroyed by Joshua, and it was not being rebuilt. But there were agricultural settlements in this area. There were people still living in the area, and people of Israel continued to live in the Jericho area. They were conquered by Eglon. Okay, so the people of Israel served Eglon, king of Moab, for 18 years. Then the people of Israel cried out, and the Lord raised for them a deliverer, Ehud, son of Gera, the Benjamite, a left-handed man. And the people of Israel sent tribute by him to Eglon, the king of Moab. So let's talk about Ehud for just a moment. Ehud is specifically described as the son of Gera. Gera is a Benjamite or Benjaminite. The the name Benjamin means the son of my right hand. However, Ehud is specifically mentioned to be a left-handed man, which ends up being an important part of the story. Ehud is a left-handed son of the right hand. And therein lies the irony of the whole story. Traditionally, left-handed people have had a less than stellar treatment in the literature of the world. If we look all around the world and look at left-handers and right-handers, generally speaking, right-handers are considered more competent, more particularly militarily competent, stronger, tougher. They're just better at military things. If you look at the language itself, in English, the terms right and left are fraught with all kinds of traditional distinctions. So the right side is correct, the Latin rectus, righteousness, all kinds of stuff going on over there. In French, the right is à droit, which means skillful or very competent, someone who is adroit, we say in America, is very good at whatever it is that he does. The opposite of adroit in French is a gauche. Gauche in English means clumsy and stupid. In Latin, rectos is the right side, the rectangle, the righteous side. The opposite of rectos is sinistras, sinister, dark, hidden, shadowy. It's not nice. If we look around at all of the languages of the world, we find lots and lots of examples where this is true, right in the language, but also in the attitudes of culture toward left-handed people. And I've forgotten what the exact numbers are. Something like 13% of people are left-handed. It's a very normal thing to be. And yet there's always been this bias. In the ancient world, left-handers generally were not recruited into the army. And if they were given something besides a sword. That actually made pretty good sense. When you've got a whole bunch of men standing in a line with a shield in the left hand and a sword in the right hand, you don't want the occasional left-hander with a sword in the left hand and a shield in the right hand. It would just, somebody would get an arm cut off. So that makes sense. And we know that the tribe of Benjamin actually had 10,000 left-handed slingers at one point. They used a sling to throw stones. So it's it's strange that that bias that's built into culture is used against the culture here. So we have Ehud the Benjamite, the left-handed son of the right hand, who was sent by Israel to pay tribute to Eglon. And Ehud made for himself a sword with two edges, a cubit in length. A cubit is about 50 centimeters, half a meter long. That's a relatively short sword. It's longer than a dagger, but shorter than a full-sized sword. The later Roman short sword was about 80 centimeters long, and the medieval sword was often over a meter. So an 18 or a cubit long sword would be a fairly short sword, but easy enough to hide. And he made himself this sword. He apparently had trouble buying one. And he bound it on his right thigh under his clothes. So he made a scabbard for his sword and put that on his right hip. Now, anyone who is right-handed knows that if you're going to put a sword on your hip or any other tool that you want to be able to cross draw, and a sword should be cross drawn and not pulled straight up, you want it on the opposite hip. So a right-hander always keeps his sword on his left hip. And everyone knows, including Eglon's security people, that only right-handers carry swords. Left-handers don't carry swords because that would be dangerous. That bias was used against them. I'm certain that King Eglon had security people who checked Ehud for weapons. And they checked his left side to make sure he wasn't carrying a sword. He obviously wasn't carrying a sling or arrows or a spear. And so they passed him by. And in he came with his sword. And he bound it on his thigh. And then he presented the tribute to Eglon. Now, Eglon was a very fat man. And the Bible specifically mentions that because it turns out to be a detail that matters here in another couple of verses. And when Ehud had finished presenting the tribute, he sent away the people who carried the tribute. That would be other Israelites. And he himself turned back at the idols near Gilgal and said, I have a secret message for you, O king. And he, the king, commanded silence. And all of his attendants went out from his presence. And Ehud came to him as he was sitting alone in his stool in his cool roof chamber. A roof chamber would be a place where you could go in the middle of the day for a shady spot where if there was going to be a breeze, you could catch it. And so this is a fairly elaborate palace. And there Ehud came to him and said, I have a message from God for you. And he arose from his seat, and Ehud reached with his left hand and took the sword from his right thigh and thrust it into Eglon's belly. And the hilt also went in after the blade, and closed over it. The fat closed over the blade, and he did not pull out the blade, the sword from the belly, and the dung came out. That's rather more information than we actually need. The Bible doesn't tell us here that Eglon died, but that is in fact what happened. And Ehud went out into the porch and closed the doors and locked them. Another interesting detail, because locks were fairly rare in the ancient world. They were complicated affairs. Only very wealthy people owned locks. The key to a lock might be an elaborate metal affair that was threaded into a thing and turned. It was really a very complex mechanical contraption. Ehud knew to lock the door. And then he went out onto the porch, locked the door, and when he had gone, he took off. He waved at the servants on his way past, and the servants eventually came up to their master's area. They saw that the doors were locked. They thought, well, surely he is relieving himself in the closet of the cool chamber. In other words, he's using the bathroom, and so they didn't want to bother him. They waited until they were embarrassed, the Bible tells us. But when he still did not open the doors of the roof chamber, they took the key and opened them, and there lay their Lord dead on the floor. Now, meanwhile, Ehud escaped while they delayed. He passed beyond the idols and escaped to Sirah. And when he arrived, he sounded the trumpet in the hill country of Ephraim, and all the people of Israel went down with him from the hill country, and he was their leader. And he said to them, follow after me, for the Lord has given your enemies, the Moabites, into your hand. And so they went down after him and seized the fords of the Jordan. Okay, this is a great story. Moab was subdued that day, and the land had rest for 80 years. Okay, what's going on next? Ehud is interesting on a bunch of different levels. My favorite part of the Eglon story is the humor. Some parts of it, the left-handed son of the right hand, the very fat Eglon, the embarrassed servant. All of this was intended by the original writer to be humorous. This was a story to tell around the campfire. The original author of this, I kind of think it was Samuel, but it may have been that there may be a story that goes even earlier than that. This original author was intending for this to be a joke to be shared. We can have trouble with that. Modern Christians are often a little more sensitive than ancient Israelites. And so perhaps it's hard for us to see the humor in what is essentially an assassination. And yet, what God intends for us to see here is his own attitude towards sinful men. See, Eglon is a very bad man. He's not only a very fat man, he's a very bad man. And he was oppressing Israel. And God, by his grace and with the power of his Holy Spirit, came down to end the oppression and to save Israel. That's the point of the story. And in the process, Eglon is not only defeated, he is made to look ridiculous. God not only defeats his enemies, he makes them look ridiculous, which is a strong statement. And I know that's not politically popular, but that is in fact what happens here. So let's go on to the Philistines. Philistines are fascinating. This photograph is taken at a place called Tel Qasil, which, as you can see, is just on the north side of a big city in Israel. And that big city is Tel Aviv. You can see a power plant over on the right side. That's one of the nuclear power plants that Israel has, and that provides electricity for Tel Aviv and some surrounding areas. The little tell here was built on the north side of the river that flows out the north side of Tel Aviv, and it belongs to the Philistines. It's interesting that the houses of the Philistines look almost exactly like the houses of the Israelites. We can tell this is a Philistine settlement because of the pottery, but they used the same kind of houses. Anyway, that's a Philistine settlement. And the word street in English is same as it is in English today. The Philistines spoke English. Okay, and we have one verse, the end of chapter 3, about a character by the name of Shamgar. We're told after him was Shamgar, son of Anat, who killed 600 of the Philistines with an ox goad, and he also saved Israel. Everything about this character and about his one verse is a problem. Everything in here is difficult. His name is a problem, his date is a problem, his nationality is a problem, his weapon is a problem. Even the Philistines are a problem. And how ever did he manage to kill 600 Philistines? The whole verse is a problem. Fortunately, it's mentioned a couple of other places, but we never get any more detail than we have right here. Everything we know about Shamgar is right here in this one little verse. I think it's fair to say that Shamgar breaks the mold of the judges cycle. Uh, I I don't usually include Shamgar as one of the judges, and yet there is a sense in which God used him to deliver Israel. But he doesn't fit the pattern very well at all. We don't see the story of sin or subjection. We know there were Philistines around, but we're not told that there was a subjection. There is no supplication. The people don't pray. And Shamgar is not described as God empowered, although that's perhaps implied. by his exploits. So he's an interesting character. First of all, his date. Any way we look at this, the date of Shamgar has to be 50 to 100 years before the Philistines began to arrive in the area of Israel. We don't really see Philistines in this area complete with 5 cities and all of the accoutrements of the Philistines until about 1200 BC. Shamgar can't be any later than 1250 BC. Variety of technical reasons. He may be as early as 1300 BC. His date is just wrong. It's possible that these Philistines were an advanced migratory group, but to be 100 years early is really early. We know that the Philistines probably came out of the Mediterranean, the islands of the Mediterranean. We don't know exactly when they began settling here. So this is a bit of a problem. We're not told anything about the names of the Philistines or anymore, but it is a date. I'd say sometime before 1250 BC. Shamgar's name is a problem. It is not a Hebrew name. There's the basic principles are fairly simple. Hebrew names are normally little short sentences in Hebrew. So a name like Daniel means God is my judge, or Isaiah, the Lord is my salvation. There's all kinds of good names in Hebrew, and most of them are little short Hebrew phrases, so that every name is meaningful. The word Shamgar doesn't mean anything in Hebrew. It's not a Hebrew name. We don't find the name used by any other Hebrew person. So what kind of name is it? Well, yeah. The best answer is we don't know. But the linguistic elements, I did a study on this many, many years ago. Wow, 50 years ago, a long time ago, that I finally got started studying Shamgar. Wrote a paper for one of my professors at Dallas. And the conclusion I came to after looking at all of the ancient Near Eastern languages in the area surrounding Israel is that the name Shamgar is most closely related to the Ugaritic language. Ugaritic is one of the languages of the Canaanites. The word gar is a fairly common Semitic word, and it means a farmer, or it means to farm, gar. MGR is the word to farm. So a farmer is MGR. The SH on the front is a problem, though. That only happens in the Ugaritic dialect of Canaan. That's a sheen prefix participle. Shamgar means a farmer, someone who is used to working with a shovel and with an ox, which takes us into the next part. Shamgar is a Canaanite. He's a Canaanite farmer. Shamgar lived along the coast somewhere. We're not told where Shamgar lived. We're not told very much about him at all. But we do know he was a Canaanite, and he is not Hebrew. He's not an Israelite. He's not a believer. He was, however, given the ability to fight the Philistines. His weapon is an ox goad, of all things. An ox goad is a long stick, about 2 meters long, fairly stout stick, with a shovel at one end, which is very helpful for doing works around an ox, and a sharp point at the other end. At the time that this happened, the shovel and the point would have been made of bronze. If you were a Canaanite farmer and you weren't enthusiastic about having Philistines in the neighborhood, it might be tempting to sharpen the shovel and sharpen the point. Shamgar would have waited around with his ox goad out in his field with his ox, doing what farmers do. And when a patrol of Philistines walked past, they would just see a farmer out in his field. He would sneak up behind with this ox goad and begin killing Philistines. And I'm sure he didn't take on all 600 at one time. I think he probably took on a patrol at a time. And when he was done, he simply buried them in his field and went on about his business. The 600 refers to the total unit of Philistines. Perhaps this is an advanced guard. They seem to be military. The British determined many thousands of years after Shamgar that one officer in the field using his voice could communicate with 600 soldiers. And so that became the British regiment size, 600. So does that mean there was a regiment of Philistines? Well, we're not told, but it is a logical number of Philistines for a military group. So Shamgar's Philistines, the date is wrong, the name is wrong, the weapon is stupid. One of my favorite commentators actually argues that the ox goad was the name of Shamgar's boat, and he was an Egyptian sea captain. That makes even less sense than what I'm suggesting. I think that Shamgar drove the regiment of Philistines away by making the vicinity of their camp so unhealthy that their commander decided to leave town. I don't think he had a lineup of 600 Philistines at one time. At any rate, Shamgar provides, I think, an interesting little interlude between Ehud and Eglon and this next judge, Deborah, and her military commander, Barak. We're going to end the share here. On Wednesday, we'll come back to the book of Judges, and we'll do Deborah and Barak, the first woman judge, the only woman judge, I believe, and a fairly important woman. She is raised up at exactly this time in Israel's history because somebody had to do it. Somehow this had to happen, and she was the one. The whole story of the judges. Let me see here. Participants. I'm going to unmute everybody. This whole period of the judges is a rather disappointing time. It's discouraging to see how Israel responds so badly to the grace of God. And at the same time, it's a lesson in how we tend to respond badly, and perhaps it's an encouragement to figure out ways to do better. So anyway, thank you all for listening. I'm glad that Italy is beginning to open up again, and enjoy your time together as much as you can. We love you guys. We'll look forward to seeing you again on Wednesday. So Bye-bye all.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, Dr. John
Yeah.
and Sister Donna. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Take care, Oscar. Take care, Joel. Bye-bye. We'll see you
Thank you.
guys. And Mike, there, I see Mike. There's, oh, yes,
See you,
I see everybody. Bye-bye, you guys. Bye-bye, Dolly. And we'll see.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.
Buonanotte a tutti.